The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook, a small frontier town nestled in the heart of Wyoming Territory, 1887. The air was thick with the scent of hay and leather, mixed with the distant aroma of freshly baked bread from Mrs. Henderson's bakery. Sarah Coleman wiped the sweat from her brow as she made her way to the old barn behind their modest homestead, her worn cotton dress rustling against the dry grass. At 22, Sarah had been married to Thomas Coleman for barely 3 years. Thomas was a hard-working cowboy who spent most of his days herding cattle for the wealthy ranch owner, Mr. Hartwell, earning just enough to keep food on their table and a roof over their heads. Their small wooden house, with its creaking floorboards and drafty windows, was a far cry from the comfortable life Sarah had imagined as a young girl back in Ohio. "Thomas won't be back until sunset," Sarah murmured to herself, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. She had decided to clean out the barn's storage area, a task she'd been putting off for weeks. The space was cluttered with old farming tools, broken furniture, and remnants from the previous owners who had abandoned the property during the harsh winter of 1884. As Sarah moved a pile of mouldy horse blankets, her fingers brushed against something solid, hidden beneath layers of dust and debris. Her heart quickened as she uncovered a wooden chest, its dark oak surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed oddly familiar. The chest was secured with a heavy iron lock, but years of moisture had weakened the metal. With a firm tug, the lock gave way with a rusty snap. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing the musty smell of old paper and leather. Inside, she found a collection of documents, photographs, and personal belongings that made her blood run cold. At the top lay a faded daguerreotype of a man she recognized immediately. It was Judge Morrison, the town's most respected citizen and Millbrook's founding father. But it was the papers beneath that made Sarah's knees buckle. Land deeds, bills of sale, and correspondence that painted a very different picture of how Millbrook came to be. Her eyes widened as she read document after document, each one revealing a web of deception, stolen land, and betrayed trust that went back 20 years. "My God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind whistling through the barn's weathered boards. "What have I found?" The documents revealed that Judge Morrison, along with several other prominent townspeople, had systematically cheated Native American tribes out of their ancestral lands through forged treaties and falsified government documents. The chest contained the original, legitimate agreements that proved the current town boundaries were built on stolen ground. More disturbing still were the personal letters detailing how they had silenced those who tried to expose the truth. Sarah's hands shook as she discovered a final, devastating piece of evidence, a detailed map showing the location of a mass grave where the bodies of tribal leaders who had opposed the land seizures were buried. The location was marked clearly, beneath what was now the town's central church. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow through the barn's broken windows, Sarah realized the magnitude of what she held in her hands. This wasn't just evidence of past crimes. It was information that could destroy the lives of nearly every prominent family in Millbrook. Judge Morrison's son was the town's doctor. The banker, Mr. Whitmore, whose signature appeared on several forged documents, was planning to run for territorial legislature. Even the preacher's father-in-law was implicated in the conspiracy. The sound of Thomas's horse approaching made Sarah's heart race. She quickly closed the chest and covered it back up, her mind spinning with the weight of her discovery. How could she tell Thomas, whose own family had been among the settlers who benefited from the stolen land? How could she face her neighbors, knowing the dark truth about their town's foundation? As Thomas's voice called out from the yard, Sarah took a deep breath and tried to compose herself. But she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The secrets she'd uncovered were like a lit fuse, and she had no idea how to stop the explosion that was sure to come. 3 days had passed since Sarah's discovery, and sleep had become a stranger to her. She moved through her daily routines like a ghost, her mind constantly replaying the contents of that wooden chest. Thomas had noticed her distracted behavior, his concerned brown eyes following her movements around their small kitchen as she prepared breakfast with trembling hands. "Sarah, darling, you've been stirring that porridge for 10 minutes, Thomas said gently, placing his calloused hand over hers. "What's troubling you?" Sarah looked into her husband's honest face, weathered by years of hard work under the prairie sun. Thomas was a good man, the kind who would give his last dollar to help a neighbor in need, but his family had been among the early settlers who received land grants in the area. His aging parents lived on a small plot just outside town, land that, according to the documents, rightfully belonged to the Crow tribe. "I'm just tired," Sarah lied, forcing a weak smile. "The heat has been getting to me." Thomas wasn't convinced, but he kissed her forehead tenderly before heading out to work. "I'll be back early today. Maybe we can take a walk by the creek, get some fresh air." After Thomas left, Sarah found herself drawn back to the barn. She needed to look at the documents again to make sure she hadn't imagined the horrifying details. As she carefully examined each paper, the full scope of the conspiracy became even clearer. The chest belonged to Daniel Wright, Judge Morrison's former business partner, who had apparently grown a conscience and threatened to expose their crimes. According to his personal diary, also hidden in the chest, Wright had planned to take the evidence to the territorial authorities in Cheyenne. The diary's final entry was dated October 15th, 1867, the same day Wright had supposedly left town for California. But Sarah now suspected he had never made it out of Millbrook alive. The sound of a wagon approaching made Sarah quickly hide the chest again. Through a gap in the barn wall, she saw Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife, climbing down from her buggy. Eleanor Patterson was known throughout Millbrook for her charity work and gentle demeanor, but she was also Judge Morrison's daughter-in-law. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Patterson called out as she approached the house. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." Sarah emerged from the barn, brushing dust from her apron. "Of course not, Mrs. Patterson. Would you like some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." As they sat in Sarah's modest parlor, Mrs. Patterson's sharp blue eyes seemed to study every detail of the room. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed rather distracted at Sunday service. Is everything all right?" Sarah's pulse quickened. Had she been that obvious? "I've just been feeling under the weather lately. Perhaps you should see my husband. Dr. Morrison is quite skilled with women's ailments." Mrs. Patterson's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You know, Sarah, Millbrook is such a wonderful community because we all look out for one another. We share our joys and our burdens. Secrets have a way of eating away at a person's soul." The comment felt loaded with meaning, and Sarah wondered if somehow Mrs. Patterson suspected something. "I appreciate your concern, truly." After Mrs. Patterson left, Sarah paced the small house, her mind racing. The pressure of keeping such devastating secrets was becoming unbearable, but she also understood the explosive consequences of revealing them. The evidence would not only destroy the reputations of Millbrook's most prominent families, it would likely tear the entire community apart. That evening, Thomas returned home to find Sarah staring out the window at the distant mountains. "I stopped by the mercantile today," he said, hanging his hat on the wooden peg by the door. "Mr. Jameson mentioned that some folks have been asking questions about old property records. Seems there's talk of expanding the town boundaries." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, just routine things about the original land grants and such. Nothing to worry about." Thomas moved behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Though it did get me thinking about our future here. Maybe it's time we considered moving on, finding our own piece of land somewhere else." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. Here was Thomas, unknowingly suggesting they leave behind land that might not even legally belong to them, while she sat on evidence that could expose the truth behind every property deed in town. Thomas, Sarah said quietly, turning in his arms, if you discovered something terrible, something that could hurt people you care about, what would you do? Thomas studied her face carefully. That's an odd question, Sarah. Is there something specific you're trying to tell me? Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She was so close to unburdening herself, but the weight of the potential consequences held her back. Sometimes I wonder about the choices we make, and whether keeping quiet about difficult truths is the same as lying. Well, Thomas said thoughtfully, I've always believed that truth has a way of coming out eventually, no matter how deeply it's buried. The question is whether it's better to control how it comes out or let it explode on its own. His words sent a chill through Sarah's body. She realized that her husband had just perfectly described her impossible dilemma. The truth about Millbrook's dark foundation was like a buried powder keg, and she was the only one who knew where the fuse was lit. As they prepared for bed that night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would tell Thomas the truth in the morning. Whatever the consequences, she couldn't carry this burden alone any longer. But as she lay awake, listening to her husband's peaceful breathing, Sarah had no idea that forces beyond her control were already setting events in motion that would soon make her choice for her. The next morning brought an unseasonably cool breeze that seemed to carry tension through every corner of Millbrook. Sarah had barely finished her morning chores when she heard the rapid approach of hoofbeats. Through her kitchen window, she watched Sheriff Reynolds dismount his horse with unusual urgency, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Coleman," he called out, his voice carrying an official tone that made Sarah's stomach clench. "I need to speak with you and your husband." Thomas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Morning, Sheriff. What brings you out our way so early?" Sheriff Reynolds looked between them, his grey moustache twitching with apparent discomfort. "I'm afraid there's been some disturbing talk in town. Someone claims they saw unusual activity around your property. Folks coming and going at odd hours, digging around in your barn." Sarah's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't understand, Sheriff. We haven't had any unusual visitors." "Now, I'm not saying I believe the gossip," Reynolds continued, his tone measured but watchful. "But given some of the tensions brewing in town lately, I thought it best to check in personally. You folks haven't found anything unusual on your property, have you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah could feel Thomas's eyes on her, and she knew her husband was beginning to piece together her strange behavior over the past few days. "What kind of unusual things?" Thomas asked slowly. "Old documents, artifacts, things that might stir up trouble for certain folks," Reynolds said. "There's been talk that someone's been spreading rumors about the town's early days, questioning land rights and such. Dangerous talk, if you ask me." Sarah realized with growing horror that word of her discovery was somehow already spreading through Millbrook's gossip network, even though she'd told no one. Mrs. Patterson's visit suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. Had she been fishing for information, or worse, had someone already been watching Sarah? "Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice taking on a protective edge, "are you suggesting my wife is involved in spreading rumors?" "Not at all, son. Just trying to get ahead of any trouble before it starts." Reynolds tipped his hat. "You folks have a good day now. And remember, sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie." After the sheriff left, Thomas turned to Sarah with a look she'd never seen before. It wasn't anger, but rather a deep concern mixed with growing understanding. "Sarah, I need you to tell me what's really going on. And please don't say it's nothing, because I can see in your eyes that it's something big." Sarah's carefully constructed composure finally crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she led Thomas to the barn, her hands shaking as she uncovered the wooden chest. "I found this 3 days ago," she whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Thomas's face went pale as Sarah showed him the documents. He read in stunned silence, his jaw tightening with each revelation. When he finally looked up, His eyes were filled with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like admiration. "My God, Sarah, do you realize what you've uncovered?" "I know it's terrible, Thomas. Your family's land, our neighbors, the whole town, it's all built on lies and theft. And now somehow people know I found something and I don't know what to do." Thomas sat heavily on a bale of hay, running his hands through his dark hair. "This explains why the sheriff was really here. Someone's been watching you, probably ever since you first went through this chest. But I've been so careful. In a town this small, careful isn't always enough." Thomas stood and began pacing. "Sarah, these documents, they're not just evidence of old crimes. They're proof that every major landowner in Millbrook, including Judge Morrison and his family, built their fortunes on murder and theft. If this gets out, it will destroy everything," Sarah finished quietly. "Or it might finally bring justice to people who have been waiting for it for 20 years, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. "Those tribal leaders who were killed, they had families, children who are still alive somewhere, still wondering what happened to their fathers and grandfathers." Sarah looked at her husband with new eyes. She had expected him to be angry about the potential loss of his family's land, but instead, she saw the moral strength that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "But what about your parents? What about our life here?" Thomas took her hands in his. "Sarah, my parents would rather live honestly on land that belongs to them than prosperously on land stolen from others. And as for our life here," he gestured around the modest barn, "what kind of life can we build on a foundation of lies?" Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, moving fast. Thomas quickly covered the chest as a group of 6 men rode into their yard. Sarah recognized them immediately. Judge Morrison, his son, Dr. Morrison, Banker Whitmore, and 3 other prominent townsmen, all armed and looking grimly determined. Judge Morrison, a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, dismounted and approached them with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. and Mrs. Coleman, we need to have a discussion about some property that rightfully belongs to this community." "I'm not sure what you mean, Judge," Thomas said evenly, though Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "I think you do." Morrison's voice carried the weight of years of unchallenged power. "Certain documents have gone missing from their proper place, documents that contain information that could be misinterpreted by people who don't understand the complexities of territorial settlement." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Mrs. Coleman, you look quite distressed. Perhaps you're suffering from some form of nervous condition. Such ailments can cause people to imagine things, to see threats where none exist." Sarah understood the implied threat immediately. In an era when women could be institutionalized for hysteria on a doctor's word alone, Dr. Morrison was offering her a stark choice: surrender the documents or face being declared mentally incompetent. "The documents belong to the rightful owners of this land," Thomas said firmly, moving protectively in front of his wife. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. "Son, you're a good worker, but you're out of your depth here. These are matters of law and governance that simple folks like yourselves can't possibly understand. Return what was taken, and we can all continue living peacefully." "And if we don't?" Sarah found her voice, surprised by her own courage. Morrison's smile was as cold as winter wind. "Then I'm afraid peace might become more difficult to maintain." As the 6 men remounted their horses and rode away, Sarah and Thomas stood together in their dusty yard, understanding that they had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The battle for Millbrook's soul was about to begin, and they were standing directly in the center of the storm. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire on a dry prairie. By the next morning, the entire town was buzzing with whispered conversations and sideways glances. Sarah noticed how people fell silent when she passed, how former friends suddenly found urgent business elsewhere when they saw her approaching. The invisible lines of a community at war with itself were being drawn, and everyone was being forced to choose a side. Thomas had hidden the wooden chest in a new location known only to them, but both realized that Judge Morrison and his allies wouldn't give up easily. The stakes were too high, not just reputations and fortunes, but potentially prison sentences for those involved in the original crimes. On Wednesday morning, an unexpected ally appeared at their door. Standing on their porch was Joseph Crow Feather, a man in his 50s with weathered skin and intelligent dark eyes. Sarah had seen him occasionally in town, where he worked odd jobs and was generally treated with the casual dismissal that frontier communities showed toward Native Americans. "Mrs. Coleman," he said quietly, "I believe you have found something that belongs to my people." Sarah's heart pounded, but something in the man's dignified bearing made her invite him inside. Thomas, who had been preparing to leave for work, stayed to listen. "My grandfather was chief running bear of the Crow Nation," Joseph continued, settling into their simple wooden chair. "He was one of the leaders who tried to negotiate fairly with the white settlers. He was also one of the men who disappeared in October 1867. Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas. "How did you know about—" "In a town this small, Mrs. Coleman, secrets have a way of finding the ears they're meant for, especially when those secrets involve the murder of innocent people." Joseph's voice remained calm, but Sarah could see the decades of pain behind his eyes. "I've been waiting 20 years for the truth to surface." Thomas leaned forward. "What do you know about Daniel Wright?" "Wright came to me 3 days before he disappeared. He was eaten up with guilt about what he and the others had done. He said he had proof, documents that would expose everything. He promised to take them to the authorities in Cheyenne." Joseph's expression grew grim. "Wright was found dead 2 miles outside town, supposedly kicked by his horse. But my grandfather taught me to track, and I saw the signs. Wright was murdered, shot in the back, and moved to make it look like an accident." Sarah felt sick to her stomach. "And the documents? They were never found. Until now." Joseph stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town beyond. "Mrs. Coleman, what you've discovered isn't just evidence of land fraud, it's proof of genocide. Judge Morrison and his friends didn't just steal land, they systematically murdered anyone who tried to stop them." The weight of this revelation settled over the small room like a heavy blanket. Sarah realized that her discovery was even more significant than she'd understood. This wasn't just about property rights. It was about justice for murdered men and the families who had never known what happened to them. "What do you think we should do?" Thomas asked. Joseph turned back to them. "The territorial marshal is due to pass through Millbrook next week on his regular circuit. If we can get these documents to him—" "Judge Morrison will never let that happen," Sarah interrupted. "He has too much power here." "Perhaps," Joseph agreed. "But Morrison's power depends on the silence of good people, and I don't think he realizes how many people in this town are ready to speak the truth." That afternoon, as if summoned by their conversation, a steady stream of visitors began arriving at the Coleman homestead. They came quietly one by one, looking over their shoulders as they approached the modest house. First came Miguel Santos, a Mexican ranch hand who had worked for various spreads around Millbrook for 15 years. "Senora Coleman," he said in accented English, "I know what you found. My father worked for Judge Morrison in the early days. He saw things, terrible things. He tried to speak out once, and Morrison threatened to have him deported. But my father kept records, wrote down what he witnessed. I still have his journal." Next was Mrs. Catherine O'Brien, the Irish seamstress, who had always seemed meek and quiet. "My late husband was a surveyor," she told Sarah and Thomas. "He was hired to help with the original land measurements. When he realized what Morrison and the others were doing, he made copies of the real survey maps. I've been keeping them hidden for 18 years, waiting for the right moment." Even more surprising was the visit from Benjamin Hartwell, Jr., the son of Thomas's employer. The young man, barely 25, looked nervous but determined. "My father doesn't know I'm here," he said quietly. but I've been going through his old papers, and I found correspondence with Judge Morrison about purchasing land that was irregularly acquired. My father may not have been directly involved in the murders, but he knew the land was stolen, and he profited from it anyway. By evening, Sarah and Thomas realized that their small house had become the center of a quiet revolution. People who had been carrying fragments of the truth for decades were finally ready to piece the whole story together. The conspiracy had been broader than anyone realized, but so had the number of people who knew pieces of it and had been waiting for someone brave enough to speak out. "We have enough evidence to put Morrison and his cronies away for life," Thomas said, as they reviewed the growing collection of documents and testimonies. "But we need to get it to the territorial marshal safely." "Morrison won't just let us walk away with this," Sarah replied. "He's going to make one last play to stop us." She was right. That night, as the Coleman house lay in darkness, Sarah was awakened by the smell of smoke. Racing to the window, she saw orange flames licking at the edges of their barn. "Thomas!" she screamed. "Fire!" They rushed outside to find not just their barn burning, but flames spreading toward the house. In the dancing firelight, Sarah could see figures on horseback watching from a nearby hill, Judge Morrison and his allies, making their final statement about what happened to people who threatened their power. But as Thomas and Sarah fought desperately to save their home, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began arriving, not to watch, but to help. Miguel Santos appeared with buckets of water from the creek. Mrs. O'Brien organized the women into a bucket brigade. Even Benjamin Hartwell Jr. arrived with workers from his father's ranch, defying the older man's orders to stay away. As dawn broke over Millbrook, the Coleman house stood damaged, but not destroyed. More importantly, the wooden chest and all the evidence they had gathered remained safe, hidden in Joseph Crowfeather's cabin on the outskirts of town. Judge Morrison had overplayed his hand. Instead of silencing the growing opposition, the arson attempt had galvanized the community. People who had been afraid to speak out were now openly choosing sides, and many were choosing truth over comfort. When the territorial marshal arrived in Millbrook 5 days later, he found a town in upheaval and a carefully organized group of citizens ready to present evidence of crimes that spanned 2 decades. Judge Morrison and 6 of his associates were arrested and eventually tried in the territorial capital. The trials revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and resulted in prison sentences that effectively ended the old power structure in Millbrook. The stolen lands were returned to surviving members of the Crow Nation, though the process would take years and never fully repair the damage done. Many white settlers, including Thomas's family, voluntarily relocated or negotiated fair purchases of smaller plots from the rightful owners. Sarah and Thomas eventually left Millbrook, but not in shame or defeat. They had become symbols of moral courage, people who chose to do what was right even when it cost them everything they thought they wanted. They moved to Colorado, where Thomas found work with the growing railroad industry, and Sarah became involved in women's suffrage organizing, her experience in Brooke having taught her that ordinary people have the power to change the world when they find the courage to speak truth to power. Joseph Crowfeather lived to see his grandfather's remains properly buried according to tribal customs, finally bringing peace to spirits that had wandered for 20 years. He became an advocate for native rights throughout the territory and lived to see Wyoming become a state with laws protecting indigenous land rights. The wooden chest that had started it all was eventually donated to the Territorial Historical Society, where it served as a reminder that the American West was built not just by brave pioneers, but also on the graves of those who stood in the way of manifest destiny. Sarah's decision to open that chest had revealed that sometimes the most important discoveries are the truths we'd rather not face. And the most heroic thing an ordinary person can do is refuse to look away from injustice, no matter the cost. Millbrook itself survived, eventually thriving as a community built on honest foundations rather than stolen ground. The town's new charter, written with input from both white settlers and native representatives, became a model for other communities throughout the territory. And in the local cemetery, a new monument was erected honoring Chief Running Bear and the other tribal leaders whose murders had been covered up for so long. The inscription on the monument, suggested by Sarah Coleman before she left town, read simply, "Truth buried is not truth forgotten. Justice delayed is not justice denied." Years later, when visitors asked longtime residents about the monument and the unusual story of how Millbrook faced its dark past, they would often hear about the poor cowboy's young wife who found the courage to open a wooden chest, and in doing so, opened the door to justice for an entire community.